26 years ago, the first movie of the Jurassic Park franchise was released and captivated all who watched it. I'm sure all of you know that the most striking feature of the franchise is the dinosaur. Dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, but the very thought of seeing one is exactly what makes the franchise so attractive. Undoubtedly, dinosaurs play a crucial role, with some inciting wonder and fascination, while others strike fear in the minds of the characters and audiences alike. With that being said, what if I told you that what we saw in Jurassic Park could be real? What if something equally wondrous and terrifying could be a possibility? Some of you may be thinking, well, that's impossible. Jurassic Park doesn't and can't exist. Well, I'm here to tell you today that it could. How? Through de-extinction, a science which, in recent years, has been speculated as a possible reparation tool. Picture it: the Great Barrier Reef, the Sumatran rainforests, and the Siberian tundra could be restored by de-extinction. The giant panda, the green turtle, the elephants, and many more endangered species could benefit from de-extinction. In other words, a majority of our environmental problems can be solved through de-extinction. Now, as good as that may sound, I am here to tell you that these results are merely fantasies. Reviving species, some of which have been gone for a long time, would bring about consequences beyond our imagination. Therefore, instrumental de-extinction should not be performed on animal species, as the newly revived species will not be beneficial to humans, as they are unable to respond to current issues in the ecosystem and conservation efforts. In order to avoid any misunderstandings, several terms must be properly defined. But first, the history of de-extinction. While no extinct species have been successfully and permanently revived, Dolly the sheep was the first to prove that de-extinction could be a reality. Dolly was cloned through the cell of an adult sheep, something new and impossible at the time, and was able to lead a relatively normal life, even as a clone. Now, on to the definition. De-extinction is simply defined as actions taken in order to revive an extinct species, while instrumental de-extinction is de-extinction done for the benefit of the human race. De-extinction is usually achieved through two common methods: cloning and genetic engineering. To keep things simple for you and me, cloning is the inserting of the DNA sequence of an extinct species into an egg of the closest living relative, while genetic engineering is the alteration of the DNA of the closest living relative in order to match that of the extinct species. You may have noticed that in both techniques, DNA plays a key role. Better knowledge of DNA means higher success rates, and that is where the limitations of extinction comes in. DNA does not last forever, and it has been observed that DNA has a half-life of 521 years. In ideal conditions, such as colder or wetter climates, DNA may last up to 6.8 million years. Unfortunately, in most cases, DNA is unusable after 1.5 million years. Another term that must be defined is the ecosystem. According to Cristiano, an ecosystem is the interaction between the living creatures in an environment with the abiotic factors, such as water and air. If we take a look around us, we can see that ecosystems are built upon various fauna and flora species. Due to its complexity, some assume that ecosystems are highly fragile and rely on very delicate balance. Some believe that when one species disappears, others will follow. This is not so. Many ecosystems have proven themselves to be resilient. Despite the extinction of several species, the ecosystems were able to maintain their existence. This self-sustaining ability is made possible through ecological succession, which can be divided into primary and secondary succession. Again, to keep things short, Primary succession is the colonization of a newly formed ecosystem by pioneer species, while in secondary succession, the pioneers merely fill in the empty roles in an existing ecosystem. On to the final term, conservation. According to the African Wildlife Foundation, conservation is the protection of an abundant diversity of species, which includes us humans. In recent years, numerous conservation efforts have made little progress due to the increasing complexity of illegal wildlife trade and the growing world industry. As a response, some experts believe that solutions such as general law enforcement, building awareness, and applying research should be implemented into society. Nevertheless, there are others who propose another solution, and that solution is de-extinction. Some speculate that through de-extinction, we are able to restore extinct key species and fix our ecosystems. This prediction will be thoroughly discussed and disproven. The carrying out of de-extinction would result in the deterioration of conservation as funds would be shifted away. In 2017, Joseph R. Bennett and his co-authors carried out an experiment focusing on the effects of de-extinction towards the conservation budgets of New Zealand and New Southern Wales. Bennett and his co-authors set up two scenarios. In the first scenario, the government would take full responsibility for supplying the funds. In the second scenario, the extinction projects would be funded by private sources. Now is where things start to get a little bit complicated, so try to stay with me. To obtain results, Bennett calculated the funding for de-extinction and subtracted it from the conservation budget. Then, he listed the cost of any actions that would involve shared time and space with other species to zero. This way, they can compare the capacity of species protection with the current capacity. Specifically for the second scenario, Bennett also calculated the prioritization algorithms with our baseline budgets, and added the cost for de-extinction to the budget of endangered species prioritization. After going through their experiments, Bennett and his co-authors were able to draw a conclusion. Even though the second scenario allowed for more species protection, both scenarios would result in the likely chance of net biodiversity loss. We know that conservation projects are costly, timely, and require a lot of devotion. Introducing de-extinction as an attempt to help will take a toll on conservation, and Bennett's research proves it to be so. Thus, is de-extinction really worth going through? Are we prepared to sacrifice the animals we know and love for a disaster-causing species? Are we prepared for other consequences that may arise? It would be a safer and wiser move to focus whatever funding there is into conservation efforts and protect the species present among us today. A successful de-extinction program will only create a new, endangered species in need of protection, further dwindling remaining funds. As I have mentioned before, de-extinction techniques rely heavily on the knowledge of the DNA. While knowledge plays an important role, samples are equally crucial. The more DNA samples, the better. Unfortunately, some extinct species do not leave a lot of remains, causing a low variety of DNA. If scientists were to successfully de-extinct that particular creature, the species would suffer from low genetic diversity and would be prone to re-extinction. This was the primary concern expressed by Beth Shapiro, who stated that the repetitive inbreeding within the species would result in undesirable genes. Sedon and Tammy backed this up, stating that the amount of genetic availability could cause the condition. Now, some of you may ask, what about the species with many samples? Surely they won't suffer the same fate. Good question. While it is true that the species won't suffer from inbreeding, they would still end up an endangered species, which requires more funding and attention to maintain. This would in turn drain even more funds and attention from current conservation efforts, leaving many species prone to extinction. Therefore, de-extinction should be avoided. Regarding the ecosystem, de-extinct species would not serve as a reparation tool. Instead, they would only serve as a disturbance. The reason as to why it is so is ecological succession. We don't need to revive the creature and reintroduce it as other existing species would handle it themselves. An example would be Yellowstone National Park. During 1988, multiple large fires caused widespread damage to the park. An estimated 794,000 acres of land was burned, and fauna species fled, leaving holes in the ecosystem and disrupting it. Nevertheless, the ecosystem quickly started its recovery, and by 1989, it was on its way to complete recovery. A few days after the fires, it has been observed that plants such as grass and wildflowers have started to inhabit the forest floor. With the new foliage of the forest floor, herbivore species such as elk, bison, and deer were able to recover from their temporary setback. They returned to Yellowstone and repopulated the area. This recolonization is an example of ecological succession at work. On a related note, post-recovery Yellowstone could be nearing its climax community, a term which refers to the possible but very difficult to achieve stability in an ecosystem. In the case of Yellowstone, this occurred without any human intervention, showing that intervention, or more specifically reintroduction, is not always required. Human intervention, especially those involving new species, would bring about unknown consequences which are more likely to be negative. Therefore, de-extinction would not benefit the ecosystem. Relating to the previous argument, de-extinct species could potentially be invasive, further ruining the ecosystem. For this case, we will take a look at the passenger pigeon. For clarity's sake, Caspar Bauer defines an invasive species as one that inhabits a habitat outside of its native range, or one that negatively impacts the environment it is in. According to Caspar Bauer, passenger pigeons are likely to fit in both categories. To understand why, I will give you a bit of background on the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon was native to the northeast region of North America. Currently, that region is largely exploited and populated by human beings, leaving the passenger pigeons without a home. As a result, passenger pigeons might be reintroduced into regions with less human presence. Problem solved, right? Well, not exactly, because this move could backfire due to the passenger pigeons' infamous flocking behavior, in which they travel in large groups and consume entire food sources quickly, effectively outcompeting other species. Another case would be the woolly mammoth. Public claims that should the woolly mammoth spread, they may become invasive, like the wild North American horse, which became extinct on the continent 10,000 years ago and were introduced 500 years ago by the Europeans. The reintroduced individuals quickly formed wild populations and became invasive. What we can see is that maybe reintroduction may not be as beneficial as we think. Through the wild North American horse, it is seen that the reintroduction of a living species brings unknown risks, and it is likely that the reintroduction of a formerly extinct species would bring even more risks. We should reconsider as to whether or not we are willing to gamble what we have for a risky solution. Therefore, de-extinction should be avoided due to concerns over the introduction of an invasive species. There are claims that de-extinction is a worthy tool for aiding the ecosystem and conservation projects, with proxies being a solution. This argument has a flaw based on the concepts of ecological succession and proxies. Since I have covered succession, I will dig deeper into proxies. The IUCN defines proxies as a substitute species that represents another entity, which in this case is the extinct species. The IUCN then stated that while the extinction might have benefits, such as restoring some biodiversity, increasing technological capabilities, and engaging public support, the potential losses are overwhelming. For starters, de-extinction is likely to cause unpredictable impacts on the ecosystem and may cause invasiveness. It would also create unknown consequences, as creating a proxy may result in the revival of ancient pathogens, potentially spreading new diseases. On a more personal note, de-extinction could physically and psychologically harm us. Psychologically speaking, de-extinction would promote recklessness, as extinctions would no longer bother us, and physically, the release of proxies could harm local human populations, rendering de-extinction an environmental and ethical concern. If things go south, human populations, as well as fauna and flora populations, could be decimated due to the existence of proxies. Also, if scientists were to succeed, people would start to label conservation efforts as unnecessary, because with such an easy solution to reverse extinction, we would stop caring altogether. This is a lethal mental and psychological impact. So, is the extinction really something worth risking various good factors? Is it worth risking everything for an extremely risky result? I say no. Instead, we must settle for a better alternative, developing what we have at the moment in order to protect our ecosystems. De-extinction is simply too risky as its drawbacks outweigh its benefits, and as a result, de-extinction should not be done. Another argument supports de-extinction on the basis of technological advancement. Basically, with repetition, scientists would be able to perfect the required techniques. While I must admit that this mindset is ideal, I must also say that this is highly impractical. Sedon wrote that in de-extinction, not only will people question the technology's ability, other implications must also be answered. For example, what would happen if the technology fails? What would happen if the released species wreaks havoc? Who would be responsible for such a case? What should be done to the animals? These are legitimate questions and must be answered properly. But with a successful de-extinction being a first-time case, we do not have a full understanding yet, and thus cannot provide the answers at this moment. If we choose to ignore the questions and push forward, we could destroy everything we have worked so hard for. Countless have devoted their time to protect species, and countless others have willingly funded conservation projects. Numerous skilled and dedicated people have conducted costly research to make new discoveries. On the other hand, de-extinction could end up with the crippling of the ecosystem and conservation projects. Is de-extinction so necessary that the dedication of so many might end up in vain? Are we willing to throw away all of our hard work? At the present moment, there are too many factors that cannot be determined, and there are too many questions that cannot be answered. Therefore, scientists should not commit de-extinction, as the implications are presently unable to be answered, rendering de-extinction as an extremely risky procedure. With all said and done, it can be concluded that instrumental de-extinction should not be performed on animal species, as humanity would not benefit due to the inability of the species to deal with current issues in the ecosystem and conservation efforts. This is largely due to the fact that de-extinction would drain conservation funds and create an endangered species in need of protection. De-extinction would also disrupt the process of ecological succession and would potentially result in the introduction of an invasive species. While I acknowledge the arguments for de-extinction, they are ultimately insufficient due to its overwhelming risks and its unanswered implications. With de-extinction out of the picture, what should we do? Well, instead of pursuing de-extinction, I believe we should turn our attention on current conservation efforts. Nevertheless, improvements and changes must be made. The scientific community should provide the public with proper and accurate knowledge, meaning that those in appropriate positions should conduct researches. In turn, the public must be willing to accept the facts and also be willing to support conservation efforts on a reasonable basis. I believe the solutions to our problems are in front of us. The solutions are the numerous animal and plant species existing among us today. We have to protect the keys to a better ecosystem, better conservation efforts, and ultimately, a better world. Thank you and God bless you.